She could see her house. The porch light was on. Her parents were inside waiting for her. She was less than 30 seconds from safety. Then someone grabbed her. Her purse was found 3 houses away. Her phone smashed. For 15 years, her family lived without answers, until construction workers made a discovery that changed everything. And then everything went dark. That was the final night of the year 2000, the last hours of a century. A night when all across America, families were gathered around television sets, counting down, cheering, kissing at midnight, toasting to the future with whatever was in the glass. A night that felt electric with possibility. A night that felt like a beginning. For the Hayes family of Bridgewater, Texas, it was the beginning of something no family should ever have to survive. It was the beginning of 15 years of not knowing. 15 years of flyers taped to gas station bulletin boards. 15 years of unanswered phone calls and cold case files, and a bedroom kept exactly as it was left, sheets changed every month, furniture dusted, everything ready, everything waiting for a girl who was never coming back the way her parents needed her to. 15 years before anyone found out what happened on that walk home. And when the answer finally came, it did not bring the kind of peace anyone had been praying for. It brought something quieter, heavier, the specific grief that comes not from losing someone, but from finally understanding how you lost them, and realizing that justice, the kind you imagine in a courtroom, the kind where someone is held accountable, the kind that feels like it balances something that was made horribly uneven, that justice was never going to come. This is the story of Lauren Hayes. This is the story of a family that never stopped looking. This is the story of a small Texas town, a New Year's Eve shift at a roadside diner, a mile-long walk home through streets a young woman had walked her entire life, and the 30 seconds she never got to finish. Stay with me, because this one matters. If you're new to this channel, welcome to Stories Soft the Missing J. Every story I bring you here is real. Every name you hear belonged to a real person. Every family mentioned is a real family that woke up one day and found their world completely rearranged by loss. I tell these stories because these people deserve to be remembered, because their families deserve to know that strangers still care, and because sometimes telling the story is the last form of justice available. Hit that subscribe button right now. Ring that notification bell so you never miss a case. And before we go any further, drop a comment below and tell me this. Have you ever had a feeling that something was wrong? A gut feeling, the kind that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up, and been right? Tell me about it. I read every single comment. Every one. Now let's get into it. To understand what happened to Lauren Hayes, you first have to understand Bridgewater, Texas. Because Bridgewater is not just a setting. It is a character in this story. It shaped Lauren. It shaped her parents. It shaped the investigation that followed her disappearance. And it shaped the way the town as a whole processed, or failed to process, what had happened in their streets. Bridgewater sat in the Texas Hill Country, west of Austin, tucked between rolling limestone hills and cedar choke valleys, the kind of landscape that photographs beautifully and feels isolated in ways that don't show up on camera. Population 6,800, small enough that the high school football stadium, which held close to 8,000 on a Good Friday night, could seat more people than actually lived within city limits. The kind of town where Main Street had a hardware store, a diner, a drugstore, a Baptist church, a Methodist church, and not much else. Where the barbershop had the same 3 chairs it had always had, and the man cutting hair had been cutting hair in those same chairs since before most of his customers were born. Bridgewater was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business. And that is not a cliche. That is a literal description of daily life in a town of fewer than 7,000 people, where the woman who taught your 3rd grade class is also the woman who rings up your groceries on Saturdays, where the man who coaches your son's little league team is also the man who fixes your car, where there are maybe 4 degrees of separation at most between any 2 residents, and on a slow day, maybe 2. Strangers got noticed in Bridgewater. That was simply the reality. Someone you did not recognize showing up at the diner was a small event. A new face at church prompted quiet conversation after the service. People paid attention to who belonged and who did not. This is important. Remember this because it becomes important later. Bridgewater was also the kind of place that young people left. They left for college, for cities, for lives that felt bigger than what the hill country offered. They went to Austin, to San Antonio, to Houston, to Dallas. Some went further. Some of them never came back except for holidays, and even that tapered off over time as their lives took root somewhere else, and the distance between them and the town where they grew up became more than geographical. Some came back, though. Some came back because family was here, because the cost of living was low compared to the cities, because the idea of moving to Austin or San Antonio felt like too big a leap, too much uncertainty, too much change all at once. Lauren Hayes came back. She had grown up in Bridgewater, had gone to Bridgewater Elementary School, then Bridgewater Middle School, then Bridgewater High School, had been the kind of student teachers remembered, curious, and talkative, always asking the follow-up question, always wanting to understand not just the what, but the why. She had been involved in everything. Drama club, student council. She tutored younger students in reading on Thursday afternoons because her own third-grade teacher had noticed she had a gift for explaining things in a way that other kids could understand. By the time she was 16 years old, Lauren Hayes knew she wanted to be a teacher. Not because someone told her she should be. Not because it seemed like the practical choice, though in some ways it was. But because she genuinely loved it. She loved the moment when something clicked for a kid who had been struggling. She loved the specific satisfaction of watching understanding land on a young face. She loved the idea that the things she taught might stay with someone for decades, might quietly shape the person they became in ways neither she nor they would ever be able to fully trace. She went to Texas State University in the fall of 1996, studied elementary education, took her certification courses, did her student teaching, worked summers, borrowed money through student loans because her parents were comfortable but not wealthy, and a university education was not an inexpensive thing even then. She graduated in May of 2000. Brown hair, hazel eyes, a diploma in her hand, and a future she had been working toward for 4 years. She came home to Bridgewater for the summer, started sending applications to school districts across the region, went to interviews, waited. In August, Bridgewater Elementary called. They had a second-grade position open. Would she be interested? She was more than interested. She was overjoyed. Her own classroom, her own students, her own bulletin boards to decorate, which she took very seriously, driving 45 minutes to a teacher supply store in Austin on a Saturday in late August, and coming home with bags full of laminated alphabet charts and construction paper and little paper apples with her students' names written on them in her own careful handwriting. The job she had spent 4 years working toward. The only problem was the salary. $28,000 a year in the year 2000. That sounds like a long time ago, and in some ways it was. But adjusted for inflation, it was still not a lot of money. Certainly not a lot of money for someone who was also making student loan payments every month, who needed car insurance, gas, groceries, all the ordinary costs of adult life. After all of that was subtracted, there was not enough left to rent an apartment in Bridgewater, let alone build any kind of financial cushion. So Lauren moved back into her childhood bedroom on Cedar Lane. The same twin bed, the same desk she had done homework on since middle school. The same posters on the walls, a few of them from high school, band posters and a motivational quote she had thought was deeply profound at 17 and now found slightly embarrassing but had never gotten around to taking down. She was 23 years old, college educated, a working professional with her own classroom and 22 second graders who called her Miss Hayes and drew pictures of her with oversized heads and yellow crayon hair. And she was living in her childhood bedroom. She was acutely aware of the gap between where she was and where she had imagined she would be at 23. Not unhappy, exactly. She loved her job. She loved her parents. She loved Bridgewater in the complicated way you love a place that has shaped you, even the parts that feel small. But she was 23, and she wanted her own space, her own life, her own kitchen where she could leave the dishes in the sink without anyone noticing. She had started talking about getting her own apartment in the spring. Said she would save enough by then for first and last month's rent. Margaret, her mother, quietly calculated the math and was not entirely sure that was realistic, but she did not say so. She listened, nodded, said that sounded like a good plan. And privately hoped that spring would come and the plan would shift, that Lauren would stay a little longer, that the house would not become empty quite yet. Parents do that. You probably know this, or you will, because Lauren had taken a second job to make the savings happen faster. Waitress at the roadside diner on Main Street. She worked most evenings after school ended, picked up extra shifts on weekends, went home tired and smelling like coffee and bacon grease, stood in the shower for longer than she probably should have before falling into bed. Tips helped. Good tips on a weekend shift could mean the difference between making a student loan payment on time and having to call and ask for a deferment again. She had already deferred twice. She did not want to do it a third time. She and her parents had fallen into a comfortable domestic rhythm that none of them would have necessarily chosen, but that had become genuinely pleasant in the way that proximity to the people you love often becomes pleasant, even when it is not the life you planned. Sunday dinners after church. Friday movie nights when Lauren was not working. Crossword puzzles at the kitchen table on Saturday mornings. The three of them passing the newspaper back and forth, arguing pleasantly about answers. Tom occasionally pretending not to know a clue he absolutely knew because it was more fun to watch Lauren figure it out and feel triumphant. Margaret was 48. She had curly brown hair that was going gray at the temples, which she had no particular feelings about because she had long ago decided that time moved forward and that was simply the nature of things. She wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck because she set them down somewhere different every time she took them off, and this way she could always find them. She had worked as a secretary at the middle school for 11 years and had developed the particular kind of patience that comes from spending your days in a building full of 12 and 13-year-olds, a patience that was not passive but active and warm and occasionally very funny. Tom was 51. He had retired from the Bridgewater Police Department 3 years earlier, after 25 years of service. He now worked part-time security at the high school, which mostly meant breaking up arguments in the hallway and checking that the side doors were properly locked at the end of the day. It was not exciting work. He did not need exciting work anymore. He had had enough excitement in 25 years on a police force, even a small-town one, to last him comfortably for the rest of his life. He was the kind of man who knew how to stay calm in emergencies, who had learned, through years of experience, that panic was never useful and that clear thinking in the first moments of a crisis could determine everything that came after. He knew how investigations worked. He knew that most cases got solved in the first 48 hours, and that the ones that did not get solved in that window became exponentially harder with every day that passed. He knew all of this the way you know something that has been part of your professional life for a quarter century, the way you know in your bones. He never imagined that knowledge would one day be the thing he reached for when the crisis was his own. December 31st, 2000. The last day of the year. The last day of the century, depending on who you asked, though people had already argued that one to death in the newspapers and at kitchen tables across the country for the better part of 12 months. The day started like any other Sunday for the Hayes family. Lauren slept in, which she almost never got to do during the school week, and therefore protected fiercely on the weekends. She came downstairs in pajamas and her old high school sweatshirt, poured herself coffee, sat at the kitchen table across from her father, who was already most of the way through the crossword. They argued about 4 across. Lauren was right. They went to church. The New Year's Eve service was shorter than a regular Sunday, which the congregation seemed grateful for. Everyone had somewhere to be. They came home and had lunch together. Soup that Margaret had made the day before and left in the refrigerator overnight so the flavors could develop, which is the kind of detail that seems small until it is one of the last ordinary meals a family ever shares. Lauren had the evening shift at the diner, 4 o'clock to 10. She had agreed to cover for another waitress who had wanted the night off to celebrate New Year's with her boyfriend. Lauren had done the math. New Year's Eve tips at a diner in a small Texas town would not be spectacular, but they would be solid. People were in a good mood. People tipped better when they were in a good mood. It was worth giving up her New Year's Eve for a few extra dollars toward the apartment fund. Margaret had planned a small celebration at home for when Lauren got back. Nothing elaborate. Sparkling cider, because that was what they'd always used for New Year's toast since Lauren was a little girl, even now that she was old enough to drink actual champagne. Party hats that Margaret had found in the back of a cabinet, slightly crushed but still festive. The television on so they could watch the ball drop. Maybe cards afterward if they were not too tired. Simple, warm, the kind of New Year's Eve that does not make for good stories at parties, but that is, in fact, a very good way to spend the turn of a year. Lauren promised she would be home by 10:15 at the latest. The diner was less than a mile away. She knew the route. She had walked it hundreds of times. She kissed her mother on the cheek, grabbed her coat and her purse, and headed out into the December afternoon. It was the last time Margaret Hayes would have a normal conversation with her daughter. The diner was busy that evening in the particular way that places are busy on New Year's Eve when they are not trying to be a New Year's Eve destination. Families came in for early dinners before whatever plans they had later. Regulars came in because the diner was where they always went, and New Year's Eve was not going to change that. People stopped in for coffee and pie on their way somewhere else. Lauren worked steadily through all of it, refilling coffee mugs before they were empty, the way a good server does, taking orders quickly and accurately, smiling even when her feet were aching, even when a table was unnecessarily demanding about the pie selection, even when the kitchen was backed up and she had to deliver the news that yes, the pecan pie was sold out. She was sorry, the apple was just as good, she promised. She was tired by 8 o'clock. It had been a long week. The last week of school before winter break is its own special kind of exhausting when you are a second-grade teacher, 22 children vibrating with holiday energy, attention spans gone completely, the curriculum essentially abandoned in favor of holiday crafts, and the reading of Christmas books, and the management of a gift exchange that always descended into some mild chaos regardless of how carefully it was planned. She was tired, but she was almost done. 2 more hours. Get home. Sparkling cider. Her mother's party hat. Watch the ball drop. Start the new year. At approximately 8 o'clock, a man walked in and sat down at the counter. Lauren recognized him immediately. She had seen him before, probably twice in the past month, maybe 3 times if she was counting correctly. He always came in and sat at the counter. Always ordered coffee and a slice of whatever pie was available that day. Always paid with exact change, not a tip, just the precise amount of the bill in coins and bills laid neatly on the counter when he stood up to leave. He never made conversation. Not with Lauren, not with the other waitresses, not with the other customers. He sat, he ate, he left. Something about him made Lauren uncomfortable. She would have had a difficult time explaining exactly what it was, and she knew that. She knew that a man who came in, sat quietly, ate his food, and paid his bill was not doing anything wrong. She knew that discomfort was not the same as danger. She knew that half the regular customers at any diner had some quality that could be described as slightly odd if you were being ungenerous about it. Lonely people found comfort in the routine of a regular table at a regular restaurant, in being recognized, in the small human transaction of ordering something and having it brought to you. She understood that, but she mentioned it to Rita anyway. Rita was 55 years old. She had worked at that diner for 20 years, which meant she had served approximately the entire adult population of Bridgewater at least several hundred times each. She had seen every kind of customer that existed. The difficult ones, the lonely ones, the ones who nursed a single cup of coffee for 3 hours because the diner was warmer than wherever they were going after, and they could not quite bring themselves to face the cold yet. The ones who were going through something and needed somewhere ordinary to sit and feel normal for an hour. Rita had the particular wisdom of someone who has spent decades in close proximity to strangers, which is a kind of wisdom that does not get enough credit. She could read a table in 30 seconds. She knew when to chat and when to leave people alone. She knew the difference between a customer who wanted to be asked how his day was and a customer who wanted his coffee refilled silently and quickly with no additional interaction. Lauren told her about the man at the counter. So there was something about him that made her skin crawl. Rita looked over at the man who was sitting with his coffee and his pie and not looking at anyone in particular, and she shrugged. She said he was probably harmless, probably just lonely, said that half the people who came in regularly were a little odd, and odd was not the same as dangerous. And Lauren was tired, and it was New Year's Eve, and she should not let one quiet regular ruin the last 2 hours of the shift. Lauren nodded. She knew Rita was probably right. She told herself Rita was probably right. And then she went to bring the man his coffee and his pie, setting the plate down in front of him the way she had done hundreds of times for hundreds of customers. A smooth professional motion, no extra thought required. His hand brushed hers as she set down the plate. Not accidentally. She knew the difference. Every woman who has ever worked in a service industry job knows the difference between an accidental brush of a hand and a deliberate one. The deliberate kind lingers for half a second longer than it should. It has an intention behind it. The person doing it knows exactly what they are doing, even if they can always claim otherwise. His hand touched hers, and then his eyes met hers and held for a moment that went just slightly past the boundary of normal human interaction. Lauren pulled her hand back. She walked away. She told Rita she was taking her break, went to the back room, sat down in the plastic chair by the supply shelves, and tried to shake the feeling off. Told herself she was overreacting. Told herself she was tired and wound up and reading too much into nothing. A hand brush, a moment of eye contact. Neither of those things was a crime. Neither of those things proved anything. She sat in the back for a few minutes, breathed, talked herself down. When she came back out to the floor, the man at the counter was gone. He had left exact change. Like always, Lauren finished the shift. By 9:45, the diner was nearly empty, everyone having departed for their parties and their celebrations. Rita told her to go ahead and head out, that she would close up herself, that Lauren had been on her feet long enough and she should go home and enjoy what was left of New Year's Eve with her family. Lauren did not argue. She went to the back room, changed out of her uniform, put on her own jeans and her green sweater and her black winter coat, picked up her purse, checked that her keys were inside, said goodnight to Rita, said Happy New Year, pushed through the front door of the diner, and stepped out into the cold December night. Main Street was alive. Cars moved slowly past, their headlights sweeping across the storefronts. Music came from somewhere, an open window a few blocks down, something with a good beat. People walked in pairs and small groups, calling to each other, laughing, the specific bright energy of people who are going somewhere and are happy about where they are going. Lauren pulled her coat tighter against the cold and started walking. 1 mile. Cedar Lane. Home. She had walked this route so many times she could have done it with her eyes closed. She knew the uneven patch of sidewalk in front of the hardware store. She knew the place on Oak Street where a tree root had lifted the concrete into a small ridge that could catch your foot if you were not paying attention. She knew the dog at the yellow house on Maple Street who always barked when she passed, an old beagle who was more committed to the idea of warning than to any genuine alarm, who would bark twice and then go back inside. She knew every block, every turn, every porch light and park car and mailbox. The first few blocks were well lit and familiar and busy. She waved to a neighbor she recognized from church, called out Happy New Year to a couple she knew from down the street, passed a group of teenagers who were too young to be out this late, but who were clearly having a wonderful time and who greeted her with the slightly excessive enthusiasm that teenagers directed at adults they actually liked. Everything felt normal. Everything felt safe. She turned onto Oak Street. The noise from Main Street dropped away behind her. Oak Street was residential, quieter, the streetlights spaced farther apart, houses set back from the road behind winter-brown lawns and bare-limbed oak trees. Still her neighborhood, still her town, just darker, just quieter. She was halfway down Oak Street when she heard the footsteps behind her. She did not stop walking. She did not turn around immediately. She told herself that other people walked at night, that this was a neighborhood, that footsteps behind her on a public sidewalk were not evidence of anything. But something made her glance back. A figure, dark jacket, hands in pockets, walking about 20 feet behind her. She could not see the face clearly. The space between two streetlights was dim, and the figure's head was slightly down. Lauren turned back and kept walking. The footsteps behind her continued. She picked up her pace slightly. Not a run, not even close. Just a little faster than she had been walking. The footsteps behind her matched her pace exactly. Her heart rate began to climb. She told herself she was being paranoid, that this was Bridgewater, that people walked at night in Bridgewater, and the fact that someone was walking behind her did not mean anything. She had watched enough true crime television, had absorbed enough cultural messaging about women walking alone at night, and her imagination was filling in a narrative that probably was not real. Probably. But the footsteps stayed exactly 20 feet behind her. Not closer, not farther, 20 feet, maintaining that precise distance in a way that felt less like coincidence with every step she took. She turned onto Elm Street. It was a slightly longer route home, but it was a more populated road, more streetlights, more houses with lights on inside, more likelihood of another person being visible, another witness, another source of safety. The footsteps turned behind her. 4 blocks from home, Lauren's hand went into her purse. Her fingers closed around her keys. She thought about the small canister of pepper spray her father had given her when she first started working the late shift at the diner. He had sat her down and explained in his calm, matter-of-fact, ex-police officer way that the world was generally fine and most people were generally decent and walking home at night was generally safe, but that carrying pepper spray was simply a reasonable precaution and not a reason to feel afraid, and she should put it on her keychain where she could access it quickly if she ever needed it. She had put on her keychain. She had never once thought she would actually need it. She thought about it now. If you have ever walked alone at night and heard footsteps behind you, and felt your breathing go shallow and your throat tighten and your senses sharpen in that particular animal way, the way your body understands danger before your brain has finished arguing about whether the danger is real, then you understand what Lauren Hayes felt in those blocks. That is not an experience that requires explanation. That is an experience that lives in the body. She turned onto Cedar Lane, her street, 2 blocks from home. She could see the familiar shapes of the houses she had grown up alongside. She could see porch lights. She could see, at the end of the block, the shape of her own house. And she could see her mother's porch light, the one that was always on. The footsteps were still there, 20 feet back, steady, matching her pace. Lauren began walking faster, almost running, her breath coming sharp in the cold air, her keys clenched in her fist. 1 block. She could see her house clearly now, the porch light glowing warm and steady. The front walk her father had shoveled last winter. The window of the living room, curtains lit from inside. 1/2 block. The footsteps behind her suddenly accelerated. Lauren ran. She covered about 10 feet before a hand closed around her arm. She tried to scream. Another hand came over her mouth. She was pulled backward, off the sidewalk, into the dark space between 2 houses, into the strip of shadow that lay between 2 properties where the streetlight did not reach. She fought. She kicked. She tried to wrench her arm free. She tried to bite down on the hand, covering her mouth. She threw her body from side to side, trying to throw off whoever was holding her, trying to create enough chaos that she could break loose, that she could scream, that she could reach the sidewalk, reach the light. Her purse hit the pavement. The contents scattered across the concrete. Her wallet, her keys, her phone, which hit the ground, and the screen cracked. But whoever had her was stronger, much stronger, and whoever had her had planned this. The last thing Lauren Hayes saw before everything went dark was the glow of her own porch light. 30 seconds away. She could have reached it in 30 more seconds. At 11:55 p.m., Margaret Hayes looked at the clock and wondered where Lauren was. She should have been home by now. The diner was less than a mile away. Even walking slowly, even stopping to say Happy New Year to every person she passed, Lauren should have been home by 11 at the latest. Margaret went to the window and looked out at the street. Cedar Lane was quiet. A few cars. A couple walking past on the other side of the road. No Lauren. Tom looked up from the television. Said maybe she'd stopped somewhere. Maybe she had run into friends on the way home. You know how Lauren was always stopping to talk to people? Margaret nodded. Yes, that was probably it. At 11:58, she went to the window again. At midnight, fireworks exploded somewhere across Bridgewater. The television erupted into cheers. The ball had dropped. The year 2001 had begun. Margaret stood at the window and felt something shift inside her. Not panic yet, but something colder than worry. Tom put on his coat. He walked around the block, calling Lauren's name in the way that you can tell yourself is reasonable. Just checking, while knowing somewhere underneath that this is not a reasonable situation, that a 23-year-old woman who works a mile from home and promised to be back by 10:15 does not simply fail to appear at midnight without something being wrong. He found her purse on the sidewalk between two houses, 3 doors down from their own. He did not touch it. He had worked enough crime scenes to know not to touch it. He stood on the sidewalk looking at the scattered contents, at the wallet that still had money in it, at the keys on the ground, at the phone with its cracked screen, and he felt his heart break in a way that he had seen happen to other people and had never fully understood from the inside until that moment. He called it in. By 12:30, his former colleagues were searching Cedar Lane with flashlights. By 1 a.m., they had photographed the scene. By 2 a.m., Police Chief Daniel Morrison, who had been Tom's partner for 10 years before Tom retired, was standing in the Hayes living room. Morrison had driven to their house on Christmas Eve 2 years ago for dinner. He had danced with Margaret at the department's retirement party for Tom. He had known Lauren since she was 8 years old. He stood in their living room at 2 in the morning on New Year's Day and told his old friend that this was being treated as an abduction. Tom said he knew. He had known since he saw the purse. Margaret sat on the couch and held Tom's hand and did not say anything for a long time. By dawn, the FBI had been called. Special Agent Catherine Ross arrived from the Austin field office before 7 in the morning. She set up a command center at the police station, requested additional personnel, began the process that the FBI had developed and refined over decades for cases exactly like this one. A young woman, an abduction, a narrow window of time in which the odds of recovery were best, and a clock that had already been running for hours. By morning, Lauren Hayes' face was on every television screen in Texas. 23 years old, brown hair, hazel eyes, 5 feet and 6 inches tall, 125 pounds. Last seen wearing jeans, a green sweater, and a black winter coat. Last seen leaving the roadside diner on Main Street in Bridgewater, Texas, at approximately 9:50 p.m. on December 31st, 2000. If you have any information, please call the FBI tip line. Rita from the diner told investigators about the man at the counter. She described him as a regular, someone she had seen maybe 4 or 5 times over the past couple of months, always the same routine, always the counter, always coffee and pie, always exact change, never any conversation. She had not paid close attention to him. He was simply part of the background of the diner, one of the many faces that came and went without leaving much of an impression. But she remembered Lauren mentioning that he made her uncomfortable, and she remembered him leaving the diner right before Lauren's shift ended. Investigators pulled the security footage from the diner camera. The footage was grainy, black and white. The resolution was the kind that was standard for commercial security systems in the year 2000, which is to say it was not good. You could make out shapes and general features. You could not see the fine details that made identification possible. The man at the counter, medium build, dark hair, a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead in a way that blocked most of his face from the camera angle. A jacket, dark colored, details indistinct. They broadcast the footage on the news that afternoon. The tip line rang constantly. People thought they recognized him. People thought they had seen someone matching that description somewhere. People called with theories, with suspicions, with the names of men they personally disliked and thought the police should look into. Every tip was followed. Every lead was checked. Every suggestion was taken seriously because in the first days of an investigation like this, you cannot afford to dismiss anything. None of them led anywhere. Margaret and Tom Hayes spent New Year's Day in a nightmare that had no edges and no exit. Police in their house, moving through rooms with quiet efficiency, asking questions they needed answers to. Reporters on the lawn, camera equipment, and satellite trucks arriving through the morning, a representative of a world that had not been part of their life yesterday and that they had never wanted to be part of. Neighbors bringing food, casseroles and cookies and banana bread, because that is what people do, and there's genuine love in it, even if nobody can eat. Margaret kept saying that Lauren had been so close to home. So close. If she had walked faster. If she had left the diner 5 minutes earlier. If Margaret had gone out to meet her. Tom did not say the things he was thinking. He had learned, in 25 years of working with grieving families, that what-ifs did not help. They never helped. They were the mind's way of trying to locate control in a situation where there was none, try to find the variable it could have changed, the moment where the outcome could have been different, because the alternative, the acknowledgement that sometimes terrible things happen and there was nothing you could have done, was too enormous to hold. He knew this. He had said it to other people. He had held other people's hands in living rooms exactly like his own and gently redirected their what-ifs toward the present, toward what investigators needed, toward what could still be done. He sat with Margaret and held her hand and did not redirect anything. Late at night, after Margaret had finally cried herself to exhaustion and into sleep, Tom walked down the hallway to Lauren's bedroom. He stood in the doorway, did not go in, just stood there looking at her things. The desk with her teaching materials still spread across it. The outfit she had worn to church the previous morning, still on its hanger on the closet door. The bed still unmade from when she had gotten up to go to church. He stood there for a long time. He knew what the statistics said. He had known them since he found that purse on the sidewalk. Adults who were abducted by strangers and not found within the first 48 hours had a very small chance of being found alive. That was not an opinion. That was data accumulated over decades of cases, patterns that repeated with the terrible reliability of patterns that are built on human behavior at its worst. He knew this the way he knew his own name. And standing in the doorway of his daughter's room at 3 in the morning on New Year's Day, he held that knowledge alone in the dark because there was nowhere else to put it, because Margaret could not hold it with him yet, because even a man who had spent 25 years staying calm in emergencies had a limit, and he had found it. And it was a bedroom doorway with an unmade bed inside. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with the words "I'm still here." Let us see who is truly following this story. And if you have not subscribed yet, do it right now. Because what comes next, the investigation, the cold case years, and the answer that finally came 15 years later, is the part of this story that changes everything. Stay with me. The first 48 hours after Lauren Hayes disappeared felt, by every account from the people living through them, like a different unit of time entirely. Not hours, something longer and heavier, something that moved differently. Tom Hayes had worked missing persons cases for 25 years. He had stood in other families' kitchens at 3 in the morning with a cup of coffee he was not drinking, and he had known while he stood there that the statistics were already running against them, that every hour that passed was an hour that narrowed the window, that the first 48 hours were everything, and after that the nature of the search fundamentally changed. He had known this professionally, in the detached way you can know something when it is happening to someone else. He now knew it personally. He did not sleep in those first 48 hours. Could not have slept if he tried. He moved through the investigation the way a man moves through water, everything slower than it should be, everything requiring more effort than it should require, while his training kept him organized and purposeful even when his heart was telling him to simply collapse. He reviewed the security footage from the diner himself, sitting with investigators at the police station, going through it frame by frame. The man at the counter, medium build, dark hair, cap pulled low. He memorized every detail that was visible. The way the man sat, slightly turned away from the room, elbows on the counter, looking at his coffee more than at anything else. The specific way he held his fork when he ate the pie. The moment when he turned his head and the camera caught the edge of his profile before the cap obscured it again. He drove the route from the diner to Cedar Lane. Again and again over the first days of the investigation. Walked it sometimes the way Lauren would have walked it. Stood on the sidewalk in front of the dark space between the two houses where her purse had been found and tried to understand the geometry of it. The gap between the two houses sat in a shadow zone between streetlights. The houses on either side had their bedrooms facing the back rather than the street. The houses directly across the road had a row of mature cedar shrubs along the front of their properties that created a visual barrier. If you stood in that gap, you were essentially invisible from the street and from any nearby window. Someone had known this. Someone had studied this stretch of sidewalk, this specific shadow, this specific gap in the sight lines, and had chosen it. That meant they had watched Lauren before, had learned her route, had mapped it, had identified the best location, and returned to wait there on the night they chose to act. The thought made Tom physically ill in a way that he had not felt since his first year on the force, when cases could still make him sick rather than simply sad. The man from the diner had watched Lauren walk home before. He had been planning, and none of them had known. The investigation moved through its stages with the systematic thoroughness that the FBI brought to cases like this one. Agent Ross and her team interviewed everyone who had been on Main Street, Oak Street, Elm Street, Maple Street, and Cedar Lane on the night of December 31st. They knocked on every door. They asked if anyone had seen Lauren, if anyone had seen anyone following her, if anyone had noticed anything unusual. A handful of people remembered seeing Lauren on Main Street, walking in the direction of home. Nobody remembered seeing anyone walking behind her. Nobody had heard anything from the direction of the gap between the houses. The two houses on either side of it were occupied by elderly residents who had gone to sleep before 11 p.m. One of them, a 78-year-old woman who lived alone, said she had taken her sleep medication at 10:30, as she always did. She would not have heard anything short of a car crash. Whoever had taken Lauren had been quiet enough and quick enough that no one had heard. The physical evidence was limited. Lauren's purse and its scattered contents. The smashed phone. A partial shoe impression in the soft dirt at the edge of one of the properties, which investigators documented and cast, but which was ultimately too degraded to be useful for identification. No fibers. No blood. Nothing that would yield a DNA profile with the technology available in early 2001. If Lauren had been transported in a vehicle, and the assumption was that she had been, there was no witness to the vehicle. No one had seen an unusual car on Cedar Lane that night. The road had been reasonably busy through midnight with people returning from celebrations, and no one had noticed a vehicle parked or stopping in the vicinity of the two houses. He had been good at this. That was the conclusion that Tom kept arriving at and could not quite make himself fully accept, because accepting it fully was too much. Whoever had taken his daughter was experienced, was careful, was organized, had planned this in advance, had executed it in a way designed to leave nothing behind. This was not an impulsive act. This was the act of someone who had done this before, or who had spent a great deal of time thinking about how to do it without getting caught. By the end of the first week, the media attention had begun to shift. That is the nature of news coverage. A missing person story in a small Texas town holds national attention for perhaps 72 hours, and then another story arrives, and another, and the coverage migrates away. By the end of January, the daily updates from Chief Morrison had become weekly calls. By February, the weekly calls had become bi-weekly. By spring, Morrison was calling once a month, and the content of those calls was always the same. No new leads. Still investigating. We have not given up. Tom heard what that meant. Margaret would not hear it that way. Refused to. She had built her daily life around the belief that Lauren was going to come home, that the answer existed somewhere, that the man in the security footage would eventually be identified, that someone somewhere would call the tip line with a piece of information that unlocked everything. She printed flyers. This is the part of missing person stories that does not get enough attention, the sustained physical labor of grief when the missing person is your child. Margaret Hayes drove to every town within 100 miles of Bridgewater, loaded her car with stacks of flyers, Lauren's face and description, and the tip line number, drove to gas stations and grocery stores and laundromats and community boards and anywhere else there was a surface where a flyer could be taped. She handed flyers to strangers on sidewalks. Asked them directly, "Have you seen this woman?" Most people took the flyer with the careful politeness people use when they want to be kind, but do not know what to say. Some promised to keep an eye out and meant it in the moment, even if the flyer ended up in a recycling bin 3 days later when they cleaned out their car. Nobody called with real information. Margaret started a support group for families of missing persons in the spring of 2001. It met in the basement of her church, once a month, folding chairs arranged in a rough circle, bad coffee in a percolator on the table by the door. Sometimes 15 people came, sometimes 3. The ones who came had children or spouses or siblings who were gone without explanation, and they shared the particular experience of a grief that had no fixed object, that could not be processed the way ordinary grief was processed, because ordinary grief at least had an ending, had a loss you could name and locate and begin, eventually, to build around. The grief of not knowing had no ending. It was simply ongoing. It was a state of suspended loss that went on indefinitely, and the people in that church basement were the only ones who fully understood what that felt like. Tom went to the first meeting and did not go back. He told Margaret afterward that he could not sit and listen to other people's tragedies when he was barely keeping himself above water in his own. He said it without defensiveness, without apology, as a statement of simple fact. He knew what he could handle and what he could not, and sitting in a circle of shared grief was beyond the edge of what he could handle. Margaret understood. She went every month. Tom stayed home. Grief looked different in every person it touched. She had learned this already in the months since Lauren vanished, watching Tom go quiet in ways that were deeper than his natural quietness, watching him pull inward and become harder to reach. She had learned to give him space when he needed it. He had learned to let her talk about Lauren when she needed to. They had reached a kind of accommodation with their grief, a way of carrying it together that accounted for the fact that they carried it differently. But the weight was enormous, and weight at that magnitude does things to structures. The FBI formally moved Lauren Hayes' file to inactive status at the one-year anniversary of her disappearance. Agent Ross called to tell them personally, which was a courtesy that Tom recognized and appreciated even as the news itself landed like a physical blow. She explained the procedure clearly and honestly. Inactive status did not mean the case was closed. It meant that active investigative resources, personnel, working hours, the machinery of ongoing investigation would be redirected toward cases where there were active leads to pursue. Lauren's file will be maintained. If new evidence emerged, the case could be reopened immediately. The FBI had not given up. They were simply acknowledging the reality of what 2001 had looked like for this investigation. No new leads, no identification of the man from the diner footage, no physical evidence that had not already been exhausted. Margaret cried for 3 days after that phone call. Not the kind of crying that is relieving, the kind that leaves you hollowed out. Tom did not cry. He got quieter. He spent more hours at work because the high school, with its ordinary rhythms of hallway arguments and locked doors and teenagers who were having completely normal small dramas, was easier to be present in than the house on Cedar Lane, which had started to feel, in a way he could not articulate out loud, like a place that was holding its breath. They kept Lauren's room as she had left it. This was a decision they never explicitly made. It simply happened. Neither of them moved anything. Neither of them suggested changing it. And so it remained. Her teaching materials from that first semester spread across the desk. The December bulletin board plans she had been working on before the holiday break. The outfit she had worn to church on December 31st still hanging on her closet door. Her bed unmade from that final morning. Margaret changed the sheets once a month. She dusted the furniture. She kept the window cracked in good weather because Lauren had always liked fresh air. She kept everything ready for when Lauren came home. If you have ever lived in a house haunted by someone's absence, you understand what this is. The way certain rooms become difficult, not because of what is in them, but because of who is not. The way you avoid certain spaces because the memories that live there are too close to the surface. And touching them on an ordinary Tuesday morning is more than you have the capacity for. The way presence and absence can somehow occupy the same physical space. A chair that someone sat in, a coffee mug that someone used, objects that are simply objects until the person who used them is gone, and then they become something else entirely. The years moved forward. 2002, 2003, 2004. Lauren's birthday was in June. Every year, on the 22nd of June, Margaret baked a cake, set on the kitchen table, put candles on it, the correct number of candles for the age Lauren would have been, lit them, sang happy birthday to an empty room, blew the candles out herself. 24th birthday, 25th, 26th, 27th. Tom did not participate in the birthday cakes. This was one of the places where their grief diverged completely, and they had learned not to push each other across the gap. He was not inside when Margaret sang. He was usually in the backyard or in the garage or somewhere else in the house where he could not quite hear her. He had started drinking more than he should. Not dramatically. Not the kind of drinking that causes scenes, that draws attention, that becomes visible to the world outside the house. Just enough, every evening, to take the sharpest edges off a grief that had never dulled on its own the way grief was supposed to. A couple of beers after dinner. occasionally more than that. The bottles in the recycling bin. Margaret noticed. She did not say anything. She understood what he was doing because she understood the grief he was trying to manage, understood it from the inside, and she was not in a position to judge the strategy when she spent an hour every June singing happy birthday to an empty kitchen. What she worried about, quietly and privately, was the distance. The way Tom had retreated to a place inside himself that she could not always reach. The way they had become, without intending it, two people who lived in the same house and shared the same loss and loved each other genuinely and deeply, but who were increasingly doing their grieving separately rather than together. A marriage is a structure, like any structure, and it can bear a great deal of weight. But the kind of sustained, unresolved grief that never reaches the phase where you build something around it, the kind that stays open because the loss itself stays open, that kind of weight does things to the structure over time. Not quickly, not obviously, but cumulatively. In the silences that grew longer. In the evenings that passed without much conversation. In the way they sometimes sat together without really being with each other. They never stopped loving each other. Love was not the issue. The issue was that love was not enough to fill the space Lauren had left. By 2005, most people in Bridgewater had stopped mentioning Lauren in the ordinary course of conversation. Not because they had forgotten, not exactly, but because the case had become part of the town's history rather than its present, had shifted from a current event to a local legend. The teacher who vanished on New Year's Eve, the mystery that was never solved, the cautionary story that parents told their daughters about walking alone at night in a way that was probably not fair to Lauren's memory, but was the inevitable outcome of a town trying to process something it could not resolve. Margaret kept printing flyers. Every few months, she had a new batch made. The printing shop in town gave her a discount without being asked. She drove her routes, taped flyers, left stacks with gas station attendants and grocery store managers who had learned to accept them with a specific kind of gentle respect they reserved for her. She had the flyers updated with age-progressed photographs as the years went by. Lauren at 25. Lauren at 28. Lauren at 30. The imaging was done by a specialist with the FBI's Missing Persons Unit. A woman who worked from Lauren's photographs and her parents' photographs and known aging patterns to produce an approximation of what Lauren might have looked like as she got older. Margaret would look at these images for a long time when they arrived, looking at the face of a stranger who was her daughter. A version of Lauren that had never existed anywhere except in these computer-generated images. In the imagination of a mother who did not know whether the person she was imagining was alive somewhere and growing older, or had been gone for years and was simply absent. The not knowing was its own category of loss. You could lose someone and know you had lost them, and that was devastating beyond description. But it had an edge, it had a shape, it had a before and an after, and the human mind was built to eventually find a way to hold it, to build a life that coexisted with the loss. The not knowing had no edge and no shape. It was open on every side. There was no before and after because the loss had no defined moment, or rather had a moment, but not a fact, not a confirmation, not the terrible closing of a door that allows the building of something new beside it. Margaret Hayes did not know whether her daughter was alive. She did not know whether Lauren was somewhere in the world, living a life that had been forced on her, or whether she had been dead since that first night. She did not know whether there was a Lauren somewhere to be found, or whether the search she had been conducting for years was a search for something that no longer existed. Tom knew, in the statistical part of his mind that never fully went quiet, what the most likely answer was. He had worked enough cases to know, but the most likely answer was not a certainty. And in the absence of certainty, you kept looking. You kept the porch light on. You kept the room ready. You changed the sheets once a month and sang on a birthday, and drove the flyer routes, and answered the call from Agent Ross, and said yes, you were holding up fine, and you kept going because the alternative was stopping, and stopping was something neither of them was prepared to do. In the spring of 2015, a construction company broke ground on a new residential development on the outskirts of Bridgewater. The development was going up on a stretch of land that had sat empty for years. A former agricultural property that had been purchased and subdivided, the kind of development that was happening all across the Texas Hill Country as Austin expanded and people sought affordable alternatives within commuting distance. Concrete foundations, framing crews, the ordinary machinery of construction. On a Tuesday morning in April, a crew working on drainage infrastructure found something in a drainage easement on the eastern edge of the property. They stopped work. They called their supervisor. Their supervisor called the police. The Bridgewater Police Department responded. The scene was secured. The medical examiner's office was called. What the crew had found were human remains. They were not recent. The medical examiner and forensic specialists worked the site for several days. The remains were recovered carefully and completely. Forensic analysis was undertaken to determine the age of the remains, the identity of the individual, and the circumstances of their death. The property where the remains were found had been privately held for the entire period since 2001. It had not been developed. The land had not been accessed in any regular way. The drainage easement, which ran along the eastern boundary, was overgrown and not easily visible from the road. Less than 2 miles from Cedar Lane. The forensic identification process took several weeks. DNA comparison was made against the reference sample that the Hayes family had provided in 2001 at the beginning of the investigation, the sample that had been preserved in the FBI's database against exactly this possibility. The identification was confirmed. The remains were those of Lauren Hayes. On a Tuesday afternoon in late May of 2015, Chief Daniel Morrison drove to Cedar Lane. Tom answered the door. He looked at Morrison's face, and he knew. He had known, in some part of himself for a long time. Had known in the way a former homicide detective knows things. Had known while simultaneously holding the other possibility open because closing it completely was not something he was able to do. But he had known. Morrison came inside. Margaret was in the kitchen. She came out when she heard the door. She looked at Morrison's face. And she knew, too. Morrison sat with them for a long time. He told them what had been found, where it had been found. He told them that the identification was confirmed. He told them that investigators were now treating the case as a homicide investigation and that they would be following every lead to determine the full circumstances. Margaret held Tom's hand. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Outside, it was a warm Texas afternoon. The trees were full and green. Someone a few houses down was mowing their lawn. The ordinary world was simply going on the way it did. Inside the house on Cedar Lane, something that had been suspended for 15 years came to rest. Not peace. Not yet. Not in the way that word is usually meant. But the not knowing was over. The investigation that followed the discovery of Lauren's remains was intensive. Forensic evidence from the recovery site was analyzed using technologies that had not existed in 2001. The 14 years of scientific advancement in forensic analysis had produced tools and techniques that could extract information from evidence that would have been unreadable at the time of Lauren's disappearance. The investigation went back to the beginning, back to the security footage from the diner, back to the description Rita had given, back to the witness accounts and the shoe impression that had been too degraded to be useful in 2001, and back to the tip line. Buried in the volume of tips that had come in during the initial investigation was a name that had been looked at and not followed up on as thoroughly as it might have been. A name that had come up from 2 separate callers who thought they recognized the man in the diner footage. The name had been checked at the time against local records, had not produced a match to anyone in the immediate area with a known history, and had been set aside as a tip that did not lead anywhere concrete. The name was Gerald Rowe. Investigators ran it through databases that were more extensive in 2015 than they had been in 2001. The National Criminal Database. Interstate records. Records from other states that had not been easily accessible or cross-referenced in the early days of the investigation. Gerald Rowe, 47 years old at the time of Lauren's disappearance. He had moved to Bridgewater approximately 20 months before December of 2000. Had rented a property on the edge of town. Had worked intermittently. Had not made much of an impression on most people in Bridgewater, which in a town where strangers got noticed was itself a kind of skill. He had a prior arrest in another state. Criminal stalking, a charge that had been plea bargained down, that had resulted in a fine and a period of supervised probation rather than jail time, and that had been entered into a state database that was not at the time accessible to officers in Texas without a specific reason to check it. He had moved away from Bridgewater sometime in mid-2001, had moved across state lines, had used a variation of his name in at least one subsequent location. He had died in a vehicular accident in 2009 in another state, under a name that was not his legal name. There would be no trial. Let that sit for a moment, because it is the part of this story that is hardest to process. For 15 years, Margaret Hayes had held together the belief that when the answer came, there would be justice. Not just an explanation, but accountability. A courtroom, a verdict, the specific and defined social ritual that says, this happened, someone did it, and society has named it and responded to it, and the person who did it has been made to answer for it. That did not happen. Gerald Rowe had died 6 years before his identity was confirmed in connection with Lauren's case. He had died in a car accident in another state, under another name, and no one who knew him as Gerald Rowe had known where he was. He had not been found. He had not been charged. He had not sat in a courtroom. He had not heard a jury read a verdict. He had not faced Lauren's parents across a room and been required to account for what he had done. He had simply died, and the case against him, built carefully and thoroughly from forensic evidence and the records that finally connected him to Bridgewater in the winter of 2000, was a case that would never be tried. The investigators released their findings, confirmed Gerald Rowe as the suspect, laid out the evidence publicly in a press conference that Margaret and Tom attended, sitting together in a room full of reporters and cameras, 15 years older than the last time their faces had been on those same screens. Margaret held a photograph of Lauren in her lap throughout the press conference. The graduation photograph. Brown hair, hazel eyes, that smile. She did not speak at the press conference. She had nothing she wanted to say to cameras. Afterward, she went home to Cedar Lane. She sat at the kitchen table. Tom sat across from her. They sat together in the house where they had raised their daughter, in the kitchen where they had done crossword puzzles on Saturday mornings, and had Sunday dinners, and had watched Lauren grow from a chatty little girl who asked endless questions to a young woman who wanted to change the world 1 second greater at a time. Margaret said, I just needed to know. I needed to know what happened. I needed to bring her home. Tom said, we did. He reached across the table and held her hand. Lauren Elizabeth Hayes was laid to rest in the churchyard of the church she had attended every Sunday morning of her childhood. On a Thursday morning in June of 2015, 12 days before what would have been her 38th birthday, the service was attended by most of Bridgewater. Second graders who had been in her class in the fall of 2000, who were now adults in their early 20s, came with their parents. Her former colleagues from the elementary school. Her professors from Texas State University. Rita from the diner. Chief Morrison and the investigators who had worked the case. Agent Ross, who had driven from Austin. Tom planted a dogwood tree beside her headstone. It blooms every spring. Margaret still bakes a cake on the 22nd of June. She still lights the candles. She still sings. There's something that needs to be said about Lauren Hayes that goes beyond the details of her disappearance and the 15 years that followed. Lauren was 23 years old. She was a second-grade teacher who decorated her own bulletin boards with care and thought. She drove 45 minutes to a teacher supply store to find the right materials for her first classroom. She worked nights at a diner so she could make her student loan payments and save toward an apartment that would have been hers. She walked to work and back because she was practical and the diner was only a mile away. She was a young woman building a life with the materials available to her, working 2 jobs, living with her parents, doing the slow and unglamorous work of becoming the person she wanted to be. She trusted her instincts on the night she died. She felt the discomfort the man at the counter caused her, and she named it, to Rita, to herself. She changed her route when she felt the footsteps behind her. She moved towards safety as fast as she could. She did everything right, and it was not enough. That is not a lesson about what Lauren should have done differently. That is a fact about what Gerald Rowe chose to do, and the reality that no amount of vigilance can guarantee safety in a world where some people are willing to harm others. But her instincts were real. The feeling she had in the diner was real. The feeling on Oak Street, The way her body recognized danger before her mind had finished building the argument was real. If you feel that feeling, trust it. Change your route. Make noise. Call someone. Walk into a business. Do not stand on the sidewalk and talk yourself out of what your body is already telling you. Your instincts exist to protect you. Lauren's told her the truth. And if you have a loved one who is currently missing, please contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Adults, or NAMUS, the National Missing and Unidentified Person System. These resources exist for families exactly like the Hayes family. Families who deserve answers. Families who deserve to know that people are still looking, still listening, still keeping the files open. Every person who is missing is someone's Lauren. Margaret and Tom Hayes still live in the house on Cedar Lane. They have repainted the front porch. The dogwood in the backyard blooms pink every March. Tom retired completely from the high school security job 2 years after Lauren was found. He volunteers now with a cold case advocacy organization, helping families navigate the investigation process. He sits in their living rooms. He holds their hands. He does not redirect the what-ifs. He understands them now. Margaret still runs the support group. It has grown. They meet at a larger venue now, a community room at the library, and the monthly attendance has grown from the days of 3 people in a church basement to something that fills a room. She has been involved in pushing for improved interstate record sharing, the kind that would have made Gerald Rowe's prior record accessible to Texas investigators in 2001. Some of the changes she has advocated for have been implemented. Lauren's room is still there. They did not change it. But a few years after Lauren was laid to rest, Margaret replaced the old posters on the wall with photographs. Lauren at various ages. Lauren graduating from Texas State. Lauren in her classroom in the fall of 2000, standing in front of her bulletin board in a green sweater, grinning at whoever was taking the picture, surrounded by paper apples with her students' names on them. The window is still cracked in good weather, because Lauren always liked fresh air. This was the story of Lauren Hayes, 23 years old, Bridgewater, Texas. New Year's Eve, 2000, 30 seconds from her front door. Remembered here on Story Soft the Missing J, because she deserves to be remembered, because her parents never stopped, and that deserves to be witnessed, because the people who are taken from us do not disappear completely as long as we keep saying their names. Lauren Elizabeth Hayes, we remember you. If this story moved you, I need you to do something right now. Share this video. Put on your Facebook page, your Twitter, your Instagram, wherever you spend your time online. One share from you could reach someone who has a piece of information about a case, just like Lauren's. One share could reach a family who has been searching for years and needs to know that people still care. Hit the like button if you believe that every missing person deserves to be remembered and that their stories deserve to be told. Subscribe to Story Soft the Missing J so that you never miss a case, because there are so many more, and every one of them matters. And leave me a comment. Tell me what justice looks like to you when the person responsible is already gone. Tell me about a case you want me to cover. Tell me that you were here, that you listened to Lauren's story all the way to the end, because that matters. I will see you in the next case. Take care of yourselves out there. Trust your instincts, and keep looking out for each other. That is all we can do. That is everything we can do.